his language around it. He was like, there was Steve Jobs casting spells and getting people to work overtime, and I was immune because I'm a minor wizard. And you're just like, what the fuck? These are like, what is this language that comes up naturally when we're talking about this of magic and spell casting? It's very interesting, and I think it tells us something about what it is. It's hard to describe, and the best language we have takes us into the territory of magic, which I do think is unconscious territory. Okay, so I should say I've read a lot of Jung and Jung influenced people, so I'm kind of operating on the assumption that there is an unconscious mind, that everyone has one, that you could call it the shadow, that it's part of us that we're disidentified from, that we don't have conscious access to at the time. It's defined by the fact that it is something that we cannot or don't believe we can integrate into the conscious world right now. And so we've shuttered it away. And it often takes the form of desires that we don't want to know we have, but definitely have, which is why you get all this stuff about sex and death and parents and all that. So that's like a background assumption I have. You may or may not have it. That's kind of what a lot of what the model is playing with. So I think reality's distortion fields, this is kind of what I said in the tweet, are essentially when somebody makes an offer to you on an unconscious level of something you badly want, but don't know you want, can't admit to yourself that you want. And they are like, I'm going to give this to you. You can have this. I will be the way through which you get this. You know, I am your new God that, you know, and that partly already explains why it puts you in such a vulnerable position, because you can't assess for yourself if this person is the route, if they're full of shit, if they're even capable of fulfilling this promise, because you can't even admit that you want the thing. And you probably have a completely different conscious story for why you're interacting with them. I'm sure it all feels very rational, you know, because we don't want to feel like we're being manipulated for the most part. I think it can also be a threat. Someone brought this up in the thread, and I think it was a really, really good point, is that it's not always an offer. Sometimes they're threatening you on an unconscious kind of implicit level. And that's also happening with some amount of deception. They may be portraying themselves as having power to hurt you in ways that they can't, or having power to hurt you in ways that they can. But either way, it's threatening a part of you that you're not identified with. Like maybe they're saying, I'll take something away from you that you can't even admit that you care about, for example, if you don't X, Y, Z, and then there's a set of conditions, right? So that's why we start to get into why is this bad for people? It's because there's always a set of conditions. I'll give you this if, you know, I won't do this bad thing to you if, right? And so it changes our behavior. Yeah, okay, so that's the basics. I want to comment on like, how is this offer or threat being communicated exactly? If we're talking about the unconscious, it's very like, what do you mean? You're not saying it. I'm operating on the model that essentially there are many, many channels of communication between human beings. Some of them are open to most of us. Some of them are only open to some of us who have put great effort into that or developed in very peculiar ways. From the mind to the emotional body to the nervous system, the somatic body, the energy, the new sphere, whatever you want to call it. So I think there's all these, this is just like my model of reality, basically. There's all these different things. And I think there are very much interactions that can happen on these other levels. Whether or not the person with the reality distortion field is conscious of what they're doing is another question. I'm not sure it matters in some sense. Yeah. So the next thing I'll sort of talk about is like slots, I think is a good concept for this, where some people are immune to certain people's reality distortion fields, right? Like if my parents met some of the people I've met, they'd be like, what a weirdo from California. And they'd be like, whatever. They're like boomers, like they don't care. You know what I mean? It doesn't map into their thing. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. it doesn't even have to be that there's like a cultural mimetic shear or whatever. I think that, you know, we might, it kind of comes back to what is it that you want that maybe is hard for you to admit that you want. Like if you want total sexual surrender and you can't admit that, someone else might want total sexual domination or have nothing really going on in that area, but they want total significance, or they want, you know, to be the most beautiful one, or they want, and this is where it gets strange, is that what we want is not always something that, if we articulated it, even sounds shiny. Like sometimes it's something really dark. Like in some way, it's actually appealing. We have a slot open for the villain who's actually running everything. Like, why would we have a slot open for that, right? It's not just dreams, it's also nightmares. And I think it's because if you introspect on it, if you have access to that, and I have done a lot of this work, at least in myself, you find there's something appealing about the dark villain who's running everything. It's awfully explanatory, maybe, or it gives you a sense of certainty, or it confirms what you always thought was true, or it, you know, at least you know where the power is coming from. Like at least it's not confusing or something like that, right? So we can have those kinds of things, and oftentimes it'll be there's like family roles. It's like, okay, this person is mapping onto my father, who is authoritarian and also my only source of love in the world. And so as soon as he maps into that slot, he gets a lot more from me than some guy that I just met would, right? I care a lot more. I'm a lot more attached. And if that's happening in an unconscious way, you don't really know that. So which leads me to my next point, which is you don't know that, but there are signs. So what do reality distortion fields feel like? You can't see them directly. You're dealing with sort of a black hole. How do you know there's a black hole? What's going on around the black hole that tells you something weird going on here? And I will fail to describe all the different possible ways this emerges. I've tried to link up some principles, some commonalities that you see, but every person is different. Every dark wizard has their own game. So I would say one thing before you, like you can, so I should name, there's huge extremes, a huge variation in how extreme your experience with someone with a reality distortion field can be. Maybe you meet Donald Trump once, you're like, that was weird, I felt really special, and you go back to your life, nothing really lasts. That was that, you know, or I felt really small or whatever. I think it can go from one weird interaction at a party to basically an entire lifetime of being caught in someone else's thing and maybe serving a role for their ego, and being off, a little off sovereignty. So huge variation. I will say, if you are not already in too deep, in their presence you feel one way, when you leave you feel different. It's especially true if it's just someone you're meeting. Maybe you feel super special or super bad about yourself, or like suddenly things make sense when you're with them, or suddenly you something is possible that's not possible otherwise. And when you're away, you maybe reground or something. You're like, sometimes it's like, sometimes what they're offering, for example, might be like a lack of mundanity or something, like something different, right? And you come back to your life and you're like, oh, my life is mundane and normal again. Maybe I'd like to go back and hang out with that person. Yeah, this is part of the story that you're in shifts dramatically when you encounter them. So your story, it's usually stories about like high importance, psychological high importance things, like who I am, what is possible, what is going on in the world, what's happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future. If I'm valuable, like what are the big figures out there in the world? Stuff like that is what is getting contacted most of the time, because that stuff, everybody's got a cosmology, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Everybody's got an identity. Everybody's got this stuff. So like I've talked to some people and I've had this experience where it's kind of like, this is more like when you enter like a cult or something like that. And you're like, oh, I just didn't realize, it turns out you can save the world. Like now I know, you know, it feels like you just figured something out. Oh, that's the answer to that. That's why that power thing works that way. And this is how, what we do about it. Oh, well, that makes the path very clear. Um, yeah, it can be very surreal, very hyper real. I talked a little bit about the exhilaration, the significance. Um, things are possible that are usually impossible. I think there's also a version which is doom, dread, inevitability. Things suddenly feel impossible that normally feel possible. I had a very weird experience where I went to a talk um, with this guy who's he's like a Buddhist guru guy, and sitting there during the talk, and I sort of feel like physically bad, and I was like, I don't know, like what's going on. This was years ago, before COVID, so I didn't have that paranoia in my head. And when I went back to my house, there was about 3 days when I basically locked myself in my room because I was so disoriented, and I had somehow become convinced through just hearing this guy talk. He was talking about monasteries. He was talking about how we make the world better. He was talking about history and future on the grand scale. And I was like, the monasteries are running everything. They've always had all the power. That's what's going on in the world. They have this spiritual resonance that's doing everything. I don't quite know how. Maybe they can even see me now. It was like crazy, crazy shit. And I was completely convinced of it. And my partner, who also went to the thing, did not have this, but got the flu for 3 days, which I happen to think is not a coincidence. There's a kind of like immune response that I think sometimes kicks in. That had a little bit of the doom, dread, inevitability, like the end is predetermined. Like you're in this story now that isn't quite your own. Um, yeah, there's a lot of features here. I don't want to get too bogged down in it. Another feature is like